863rd, this is Chaplain Brad, your battalion chaplain. I just want to address the topic that's on most of our minds this week, racial injustice in our country. Many of you have seen the open letter written by the senior Army leadership addressing racism and injustice in our country, in which they compel us to open up space for the uncomfortable questions to be asked, for us to be compassionate and humble towards each other, to open up a space for grievances to be expressed. And that's what I hope that this will allow us to continue to do, as other leaders in your units are, I'm sure, going to do the same. Of course, our nation is politically divided. There are different opinions about issues of looting and physical property damage and all of that. But let's keep the big picture in mind here. Let's keep humanity at the forefront. Let's keep the heart and soul of the matter in full view. Let's keep respect for one another in this discussion as the priority. The leadership values of the Army include that word, respect. And the definition the Army gives is to treat people as they should be treated. Now, people could have different opinions on what that means. We could even say, well, I think I should have treated them like this, but it actually might be mistreatment or injustice at the end of the day. I think maybe a deeper rule on which this principle is based is the golden rule that Jesus gave in his teachings in the Gospels, where he says, do to others as you would have them do to you. That's a little harder, isn't it? To put yourself in someone else's boots and to ask yourself, what would I want done to me? That's how I should treat them. In the Army, we often live by the brass rule. If you're higher brass, you can treat them as you used to be treated when you were lower, when you were a scrub, when you were under someone else's authority. But that doesn't always translate to respect, does it? Put yourself in someone else's boots and practice the golden rule. What would you have done to you? Do that to them. In the Bible, there's a story in the Hebrew Scriptures about a man named Nehemiah, who was a Jewish exile. The Jewish people had been taken into the land of Babylon for 70 years of exile, and then the Persians came in and opened a can of whoop on the Babylonians, and one of the projects that the Persians did is to resettle and repopulate the lands of those that had been conquered by the Babylonians. Well, this man Nehemiah was now finding himself in a high position of authority in the Persian government. He was a Jew, but he was acting basically as Secretary of State. His title was cupbearer, but he was a very important administrative official. And he hears news of his homeland, Judah, southern Israel, and some of his brothers come from Israel and say, the city is still a broken place. There's still rubble. The walls are still broken down, and now we're vulnerable to attack from outside enemies like never before. When he hears this news, he's a man of action, and he takes action quickly. He's decisive. He's efficient. He comes up with the idea, secures federal funding from the Persian government to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. But before he does that, he does one important thing, and that's what I think we need to remember as a team. We need to, before we act, before we rush into our mission, we need to stop and listen. We need to empathize with those that are hurting. That's what he does. He stops, he sits on the ground literally, and he weeps, and he grieves, and he shares the pain of those who are far away in another place, those that he has no immediate connection with. But he knows that as a fellow human and as a fellow Jew in this story, he has a responsibility to bear. He prays a prayer in which he says, we have sinned, I have sinned, and my Father's house has sinned. And in doing that, he identifies, he enters into solidarity with a people who lived a couple generations before him and committed certain injustices and sins that now they had to pay the price for. But he says, I realize my participation in that as well, my complicity in that, and he owns that humbly. I think we need to do that. We need to ask ourselves the hard questions. What part have I played or not played that I should have in the racial tensions, the injustices that have happened in our country, even in our Army? Because the history of our Army is one of injustices towards African Americans. I don't know if you know much about the history of African Americans in the Army, but for a long time, soldiers were told to hurry up and wait. Hurry up and wait for your rights to come. Did you know that even though African Americans served in every war in American history, essentially up until World War II, they were still never given a Medal of Honor for any of that service until 50 years after World War II. And even then, some very valiant efforts were not recognized. You can read about some of those stories. I'll share some links at the end that you could Google to find out more. But let me just share a brief word of an article I read from the Chicago Tribune this week, an editorial by a black man named Javante Anderson. In this article, he writes, giving us an insight into what it's like to be a black man in America and witness some of the gruesome deaths like we have this past week of George Floyd's death in Minneapolis. He says, each death I absorbed as if I were a blood brother. Each tweet I read about them and every minute of news I watched took a little piece of my soul. Seeing an officer kill another black man is like watching my own funeral, he says, or my brother's or my father's. It highlights the frailty of my existence. It conjures up thoughts of slavery, lynchings, fire hoses, Jim Crow, and Rodney King. It opens up emotional scars. It forces me to question my worth. He says, that's why my hands trembled on the steering wheel the last time I was pulled over by a white officer. For him, it was a routine traffic stop. For me, it was life or death. He said, it makes me feel more like and then he says the N-word, than less like a man. As a black man, I've not given up on humanity, though. I will not give up. There's too much good in the world. And then he closes with this. We need white people. We need good police. We need one another. But I beg of you, America, please hear our cries. I'm listening. I hope that all of us will listen to one another. I hope that we will no longer say, hurry up and wait for justice, because we've done too much waiting and not enough hurrying up. And in this current climate, we cannot wait. We need to be in a hurry to hear each other's stories, to respect all people, to continue the mission, and not just to say, hey, equal rights for all, but to pay extra attention and give extra time and sympathy to those who've been fighting a harder fight than some of us can ever imagine, than any of us, whether we're in uniform or not, can ever fully understand, unless we say, I want to practice the golden rule. I want to show true respect. I want to let that be the shining light in this dark time. And so here in the 863rd, I encourage you to open up those conversations. Get in touch with me. I'll put my email address at the end of the video. Set up an appointment during virtual battle assembly. Join me on Sunday morning for 10 to 10:30 a.m. Bible study, in which we'll discuss these issues more from the scriptures. Read a book on race relations in America, maybe the book by Natalie Moore, The South Side, about the South Side of Chicago, where I live. Watch a documentary or movie about race in America. Do something. Start the conversations. Think about this. Enter into this space with true respect and compassion, because we are one team, one fight. And with that, I'll say grace and peace to you. Chaplain Beier, out.